So welcome everyone to another Dolphin Communication Project Deep Dive. We are very excited to share the information with you this evening, even if we aren't so excited that the topic has to be discussed. But we are joined by Amberly Kincaid from Mote Marine Lab, and we are extremely grateful for her time this evening. And she's going to walk us through understanding the current Florida Manatee unusual mortality event. Of course, there will be not so happy things discussed and images. So that's your warning that this is a conversation for mature audiences. As a reminder, you can submit your questions to the chat if you're listening live. And if you're listening to the recording, we hope you enjoy it. With that, I will pass it over to Amberly.
Thank you. Okay, let me get my screen share up. Okay, everybody can see that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you guys so much for having me. I always love getting to come together with past experiences and my present experience. So for anybody who doesn't know, I did a field course with DCP back in 2017, I think. Which I can highly recommend if anyone is interested. It was an incredible experience and certainly got me some of the experience that I needed to move into this career, which is really exciting. And I'm just happy to be able to talk about a little bit about what I do and what's going on. So what we're gonna talk about today is the unusual mortality event that's going on in Florida on the East Coast with our manatees. And it's something that is pretty gravely concerning, but hopefully fixable. So we'll talk about kind of how we got to where we are and what's going on, and then what is being done to help, what we can do to help, and hopefully get some positives out of it. So to start us off, we'll just give a little bit of information about the manatee, more commonly known by the public as floaty potatoes. I always like that term for them. They're a subspecies of the West Indian manatee, and they are fully aquatic mammals, but they are most closely related to elephants, which I find fun because elephants are my favorite animal of all time. So manatees hold a really special place in my heart. They're primarily herbivorous, feeding mostly on seagrasses and aquatic vegetation. There have been some anecdotal reports of manatees eating fish, but most of their diet is vegetation. And the current estimates, it's hard to get a really good estimate because, of course, they live in a 3D environment in the water, and so they move. So the best estimates that we have of their population in Florida is somewhere between about 5,700 to 7,500. That estimate was taken before the current mortality event, so that number will have gone down quite a bit by now. But that's kind of the range that we think that they're at right now. In the state of Florida, they're managed by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, or FWC, and nationally they're managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so anything that is done with manatees has to be permitted. So for example, Mote has a letter of agreement that permits us to not only respond to manatees, we'll verify if we get a report of a injured or stranded or ill manatee, we will recover deceased manatees and we can assist with rescues. But Mote also houses two manatees, Hugh and Buffett, and they are part of our exhibit animals. They were born and raised under human care, but even for that, we have to have a permit because manatees are so carefully managed under both the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. They're currently listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, which should be exciting because they used to be endangered and they were recently downlisted to threatened because their numbers had recovered so well. But unfortunately, the current events are causing conversation about whether they should be relisted as endangered. Some of the threats that manatees face include both natural and anthropogenic or human-caused threats. So the anthropogenic threats we see most commonly are watercraft impact. That's the number one human-related killer of manatees. They'll also get entangled in fishing gear, crab pots, marine debris. They're very tactile animals, and so they really like to feel around in their environment. And unfortunately, a lot of times that can lead to them wrapping their fins or their whole bodies up in whatever is out there that they're rubbing themselves on. Entrapment, they'll get themselves in culverts and behind weirs. And then there are other weird things that happen sometimes, people harassing them, things like that. And then I listed starvation under an anthropogenic threat because while starvation can be natural, currently what they're facing is a lot of starvation that is secondary to human activity, which I'll describe a little bit in more detail a little bit later. And then of course, they have natural threats as well. So just like us, they can get sick, they can get injured without the presence of humans, they'll get diseases. They'll get cold stress, which the top right picture is a manatee that not only is thin, but also has cold stress lesions. That's those white patches on the skin there. And basically, when manatees are in water that's below 78 degrees Fahrenheit for a long period of time, they'll start diverting their blood flow. And so their blood doesn't get to their extremities and their skin as well as it normally would, because it's working on keeping their internal organs warm. And so they'll start to get lesions, and it's almost like a frostbite situation, but not quite. And then that can turn into systemic illness that can greatly affect their health, more so than just the skin lesions. They also can be orphaned, and that can be secondary to an anthropogenic threat. So if a mom gets hit by a boat and killed, and then the calf is orphaned, that would be considered a human cause. But sometimes they're orphaned because the mom dies of natural causes, or with first-time mothers, they're not always great mothers, so they can abandon or get separated from their kid. And then they'll sometimes get out of habitat. So after hurricanes, they'll sometimes end up in the woods because the storm surge was so great that they followed the water and followed the vegetation into a place that doesn't normally have water. So things like that, or they'll get themselves into retention ponds by following a system of culverts. So some of the rescues that are done are really just about relocating manatees who have kind of gotten themselves lost. So currently what's going on is we have a number of manatees that are dying, and it's much higher than average. So excuse me, I put together a 10-year average of mortality and rescues. Some of that includes overlap, which I didn't account for, but some rescues don't make it once they're in rehab, so they'll contribute a little bit to the mortality as well. So our averages are around 570 carcasses a year and almost 100 rescues a year. And in 2021, in kind of the early part of the year, January, February, we started seeing a huge increase in manatee carcasses and rescues on the East Coast. And the East Coast FWC labs were reporting high numbers of dead manatees and really skinny live manatees that were floating sideways, which is not a typical thing that we see. With boat-struck manatees, oftentimes the hull of the boat or the force of the impact will break a rib or two or three or many more, which then can puncture the lung or the lung cavity. And manatees have a separate cavity for each lung. So when a lung gets punctured, that pleural cavity can fill with air, and so they'll float with one side higher than the other. But these manatees were completely sideways and didn't necessarily have evidence of boat strikes. And so it was a weird finding that kind of kept coming up. And then in necropsy, which is like an animal autopsy, they were finding acorns in some of their GI tracts, which is not a normal part of manatee diet. And so, initially we didn't really know what was going on. And it was just this kind of odd finding that was happening. And then that trend continued, and they determined that they weren't getting enough food, particularly on the East Coast. And the numbers overall in the whole state have gone up, but the East Coast starvation manatees are really the focus of the unusual mortality event, and were really the kind of concerning finding. And it's happening mostly along the Indian River Lagoon. And so the numbers are pretty devastating. This year, I tallied up numbers as of Monday, and comparing them to this time last year, we're doing a little bit better. It's not quite as extreme as last year, but we're certainly nowhere near average. We're not near what we should be for this time of year. To tell you a little bit about unusual mortality events, it's a formal term that is under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And there was a working group formed in 1991, and it basically was to formalize responses to unexpected significant die-offs, oftentimes because of funding or channels that certain rescues and responses have to go through. Sometimes there can be a little bit of a lag, and we're not necessarily equipped to handle huge numbers of stranded or dead animals kind of one day after another. And so this allows us to more quickly respond in real time to these large, devastating numbers of animals. And so there's a set of 7 criteria that basically make measurable ways to determine that the event falls under the category of an unusual mortality event. And then once that's declared, there's a contingency fund that can help investigation and response. So that fund can help put together extra people or extra supplies, or whatever is needed that isn't readily available to respond to these high numbers. So the chart here is from NOAA Fisheries website, and it has a graph of all of the unusual mortality events from 1991 to present. And then the colors are by cause. So gray is undetermined or pending. So most of them, we don't necessarily know what caused all the die-offs. Some of them are human interactions, ecological factors, biotoxins like red tide, or infectious disease like something like distemper. But a lot of them are undetermined. And actually I'll put this link in the chat, because it's a really interesting website if you're interested in learning more about unusual mortality events. So I will put that, there we go. So some past UMEs, which is what I'm going to call them because I'm not going to say unusual mortality event through the whole thing. Past UMEs include in 2018 and 2019, where Mote is, and a little bit south, we had a bottlenose dolphin UME that was caused by red tide. So Mote alone responded to over 30 bottlenose dolphins, which is about twice the number that we get in a given year. And it came fast, and it was the kind of situation where a biologist would go out and recover a carcass, and on their way back get a call that there was another carcass on the same beach. So it was a really stressful time that required those additional resources for sure. Of course, in 2010, everybody remembers the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So that involved multiple cetacean species in the Gulf of Mexico. And that went on for 4 years because, or a little over 4 years, I think, because the negative effects of that oil spill were not quickly cleaned up and fixed. And then recently in 2018 to 2020 in the Northeast, there was a pinniped UME from distemper virus. And so a lot of the seals in kind of like the Maine and New England area unfortunately succumbed to that. So currently there are 6 active UMEs, which is unfortunate, but at least they're being addressed and properly handled. So when I was looking at the list to kind of put together information about UMEs in general, I noticed that in addition to the current Manatee UME, there are 4 previous UMEs that involved the Indian River Lagoon. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what that is. And it's basically a shallow estuary along Florida's east central coast that occupies primarily Brevard County. And it's comprised of kind of several different parts. So there's the North, Central, and South Indian River Lagoon, and then it kind of breaks off into the Banana River, and then up north is Mosquito Lagoon. And so in this area, there's been a die-off of seagrass going on for a little over 10 years. And that may be contributory to some of these UMEs, or the same contributing factor could have caused the UMEs and the seagrass die-off. So for example, in 2013, 111 manatees were part of a UME, and the only thing they could find was infectious disease, but they think that it was secondary. So it's listed, the formal reason, infectious disease secondary to ecological factors. And there are theories that they had to change their diet because of a lack of available seagrass, which then made their gut microbiome unable to properly handle some kind of introduced or unknown pathogen. So it's kind of a chain of events that caused this, that may have started with a lack of seagrass. There was also a 2013 dolphin UME, and the only common finding was starvation. So again, that's listed as ecological factors, but it may have been that there was a lack of available fish, possibly also due to something about the water quality in the Indian River Lagoon. So the current Manatee UME is technically listed as an Atlantic UME, but it's mostly involving the area surrounding the IRL. So I would personally count it as involving the Indian River Lagoon, even though that's not listed on the formal website. So what's happening? Manatees, like I said, they need water that's over 78 degrees if they're going to be there for a prolonged period of time. So every winter, manatees make their way to warm water sites like springs or power plant outflows, things like that. And oftentimes those areas don't necessarily contain food, so they venture out to nearby food sources for short periods of time before going back to the warm water site. If they go out of the warm water site too long to look for food that isn't there, then they run the risk of becoming cold stressed. But if they don't leave the warm water site to find food, then they run the risk of starving. So they are kind of having to make a difficult decision if there isn't food readily available where they normally expect it. And when we're talking about manatees and what they eat, I mentioned they are herbivorous. They eat primarily seagrass and aquatic vegetation, and they need to eat 4 to 9% of their body weight per day. And adult manatees average well over 1,000 pounds. I think the heaviest on record is around 3,500 pounds. So it's quite a lot of food that they require each day. So the Indian River Lagoon in particular has been kind of affected by urbanization and kind of humanization of Florida, if you will. So all the way back in 1916, there was the Drainage Acts of Florida, and that allowed for building of canals, primarily for to make room available for agriculture, or make the land usable for agriculture, for mosquito control, for flooding. And this resulted in a lot more water flowing to the Indian River Lagoon from the uplands than would naturally happen. And then, of course, everyone in the world moved to Florida recently. So over the past century or so, there's been a really rapid urbanization of Florida. And so all of that development, particularly with septic systems, has led to an influx of nutrients draining into the Indian River Lagoon. And this also includes fertilizer, agricultural runoff, things like that. And that has all led to the water experiencing a high level of eutrophication, which basically means there are too many nutrients in the water that wouldn't naturally be there. So the pictures on the left are some cool old pictures that I found of the canals being built. And then on the right was an interesting study that Morris and Bernstein did in 2004 that investigated a natural die-off and regrowth of seagrass in the Turnbull Bay portion of the Indian River Lagoon. And that was kind of an interesting study because it showed that there should be natural cycles in seagrass availability, but what we're dealing with now hasn't recovered in the amount of time that it should have. So we know that we're dealing with something that's not part of the natural kind of waxing and waning of seagrass availability. And as I mentioned, the seagrass has been kind of dying off for a little over a decade. And what we saw was that in 2020, the last of the seagrass in Mosquito Lagoon collapsed, which was that northernmost portion of the IRL. And so that kind of started what we're dealing with now. And now that we're in the beginning of 2022, we're dealing with manatees who have been dealing with this problem for 2 years now instead of just one. So they've been under the stress of trying to find food for much longer than they should have to. So of course, in addition to all of our starving manatees, we have the regular amount of manatees that need to be rescued or recovered every year. So as I mentioned, there were all those anthropogenic and natural threats. Those manatees are still happening. And so the starving manatees from the East Coast are straining an already overloaded system. So there's a group called the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership in Florida. And they coordinate, and actually, I shouldn't say just in Florida because we also have partners in other states, but they coordinate care for rescued manatees over many different facilities. And there's also a component that tracks released manatees. So some manatees, when they get released, get a satellite tag, and it looks like kind of a little buoy with an antenna. That's the MRP logo there on the right has a little cartoon buoy satellite tag on a manatee. And so they'll sometimes track, and that can be helpful because if you have a manatee that was rescued as an orphan and doesn't necessarily know where to go for warm water, they'll be released in the winter, usually in a warm water site. So they have kind of a head start on learning where to go. But if they're one of the tag manatees and the following winter, they see that they're not going to the right place, they can sometimes intervene if necessary to get them back on track. So there's 5 critical care facilities once a manatee is rescued in Florida that will take care of the manatee. And then there's additional rehab facilities. I've listed some of the ones here that we work with regularly, and then there are many others. And we're actually starting to see a lot of people have been amazing and really stepped up to help these manatees. So we're seeing extra, facilities that don't normally take manatees are getting outfitted with whatever they need to be able to take manatees, to make room for these critical manatees in those acute care facilities. And then some of the facilities that already operate are expanding what they can do for us. So Columbus Zoo just took 4 extra manatees. It was a really cute story in the news about DHL custom built shipping containers for the manatees to be sent from SeaWorld to Columbus Zoo. SeaWorld just made an announcement that they're constructing 5 new manatee rehab tanks, and Clearwater Marine Aquarium also announced the construction of a manatee rehab center. So really everybody has been coming together to just do whatever they can to help this manatee crisis, because you can only rescue a manatee if there's a place to put it. And we're starting to get close to that point of not having room for manatees to be rescued. So, for every starving manatee on the East Coast, there might be a cold stressed manatee on the Gulf Coast, or one that gets hit by a boat, or 3 starving manatees on the East Coast in one day. So there's a lot of need right now that people are just frantically trying to meet. But it's been really exciting to see how much people are helping. But at the same time, it's been kind of stressful and sad to see how many manatees need that help right now. So let's talk about what we're going to do and how we can help these manatees. The main principle of the rescue and recovery groups, or the stranding groups, is to rescue the ones that we can, and take them to rehab facilities when they need it. And then we want to learn from the mortalities. We wouldn't really understand what was going on with this event if we weren't able to do necropsies on the manatees that died and find out that they're all starving to death. And that was kind of what was going on here. So that can be a really, really important tool in seeing what's going on with these animals. And then in addition to that, which is kind of what we always do anyway, The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, FWC, and Florida Power and Light have established a temporary field response station, and this is at the Cape Canaveral Clean Energy Center, or CCEC, which is a normal warm water site for manatees. So there's a normal warm water outflow from the power plant. So manatees are coming there anyway, and what they've done now is to include short-term feeding. So they've set up these stations, which you can see the two pictures on the right, where they've got some PVC boundaries, and they've set up tarps so that hopefully the manatees don't see the humans feeding them, because since they are protected, it is illegal to feed manatees, and we don't want manatees to associate humans with food and seek humans out, because not every human is going to act responsibly, unfortunately. So they've got these little feeding areas set up, and they're tossing in romaine lettuce, which is a staple diet of manatees in rehab and in human care. And we're hoping that this temporary feeding site will enable the manatees that really can't find any food to come get food, and kind of buy them some time while we fix the bigger problem. And this is part of this is because it's a UME and there's that emergency funding, that contingency funding, and people are being able to, they're able to get the romaine lettuce, they're able to send people out to help, and there are also additional resources that are helping from all over the state. So just helping with rescue and recovery, people have been sent out from different stranding organizations all over the state, and there's additional supplies being sent over there. So there's a big group effort, not only for this feeding station at the CCEC, but also to just send people and supplies to the areas that need it most to work on the rescues and recoveries and necropsies of these manatees. And I figured I'd give you a slide of just really cute manatee pictures, because after kind of a depressing state of events, I think it's nice to just look at the happy, cute, fat manatees. So hundreds of manatees have been visiting the feeding site. The only thing is we're not sure yet who's eating the food. So it's not, there's no doorman saying only the emaciated manatees are allowed to come in. So all the manatees that are coming into this site are allowed to eat. So there's plenty of healthy manatees that are also making the most of the situation, but we're really hoping that those manatees that are struggling and really need it are also getting those nutrients. One important thing to note is that the people working at this site are taking care to clean up any uneaten food, because there was a concern that leaving the lettuce in the water, if the manatees don't eat it, will then provide more nutrients for the water, which is the whole problem in the first place. So I thought it was kind of cool that they're taking care to really minimize the effect on the environment from this temporary feeding site. And then, of course, as I mentioned, this top left picture, you can see a lot of those little satellite tags. And so they can watch which manatees are in here, and make sure that the tagged manatees are going to the right place as well. So the longer term solution is to clean up the Indian River Lagoon. That's really, the feeding of the manatees isn't going to ultimately matter if we don't have a long-term solution. And this is the feeding site is supposed to be a short-term kind of emergency solution for right now. So we really need to work on fixing the bigger problem so that this doesn't happen again, and that the manatees can kind of go back to normal in the future. So the good news is recently Florida was given $53 million to clean up the Indian River Lagoon. And most of that funding is going to switching from septic to sewer. So as I mentioned, a lot of the issue is that septic tanks drain nutrients into the bodies of water around them. So this is going to hopefully take out, one figure I read said it was going to remove 200,000 pounds of nitrogen from going into the water every year. I don't know for comparison how much nitrogen is in there to begin with, but it sure sounded like a lot. So I was encouraged by that. And then even since before this, there's been ongoing seagrass restoration research. There's a lot of interest in seagrass. seagrass is protected in a lot of areas. And so it's good that we kind of have that information already at our disposal, so that once the water is cleaner and is more livable, then the seagrass can thrive. And I'm just realizing, I think I forgot to mention the connection between the nutrients and the seagrass, and I apologize for that. So what it is that with this eutrophied water, with the eutrophication and all the nutrients going into the water, it feeds a lot of algae. And so the algae stays on the surface of the water and blocks the light. And that's what's really bothering the seagrass. What's really causing the problem is that there is so much algae that wouldn't normally be in the water in such high quantities that it's choking out light and resources for the seagrass to grow. So that's why we need to really clean up the water before any kind of restoration of the seagrass will work, because the water needs to still be habitable for that seagrass. And then things like this, webinars and news stories and things to educate the public is going to be really helpful long term, because especially when you involve manatees in Florida, people will take an interest and hopefully do the right thing and see where they can help. And being aware is half the battle, to just let people know that this is going on and something needs to be done. And then we are hopefully going to learn from the past. So the biggest thing that we can do with what's going on now is not to let it happen again. So unfortunately, there's already some evidence that a similar situation is starting in Tampa Bay. So I'm really hoping, and we are all really hoping, that this is enough of a lesson to us that we can get the Tampa Bay situation under control before it's too late. Because the worst thing to do is wait until it's this size problem to fix it. So hopefully this can be our lesson to kind of collectively, as a state, as a country, as a planet, be a little better to the environment and do a little more proactive work, so that we're not waiting until we're at this kind of crisis to start to take action. And then everyone always wants to know how they can help. And it feels, in situations like this, they can feel really insurmountable. They can feel really like a problem that the individual can't help with, and you feel really helpless. But there are some things we can do. Much of the onus for a problem like this is on the government and larger corporations, for sure. But there are some things that we can do to help on a smaller level. So the number one thing is find out your local stranding organization, put their number in your phone, and then report any sick, injured, distressed, or dead manatees to that number. And that most organizations also will do marine mammals of all kinds, sea turtles. Mote responds to sea turtles, manatees, dolphins, and whales. So learning kind of who to report an injured or distressed marine animal to can help in the moment if you see one. Anybody who's a Florida resident can purchase a manatee license plate, and that goes directly to funding the manatee rescue and research. Minimizing fertilizer and pesticide use. This is a big one because everybody wants a nice lawn, but there are fertilizers and pesticides that use lower levels of nitrogen and phosphorus. And those, if you need to use one, those are the ones to pick. But like, I personally have a very sandy kind of blah backyard, and it's fine. So I try not to use any of that stuff, just so that I'm not contributing. And this was an interesting one that I hadn't thought of or known about, but makes a lot of sense. They suggest when you're making or repairing docks to use grating instead of planks, because it lets light through, which I thought was a pretty cool thought to have. And then it also, I think, letting light through not only will help seagrass, but helps in general the aquatic environment that would be under your dock. So I would imagine you end up getting to see a little bit more of the natural habitat that way too, which is kind of cool. And then of course, beach cleanups, recycling monofilament line is a big one, and avoiding boating over seagrass, and avoiding boating over manatees, for sure. So a lot of what we can do to help is making sure we're not contributing to other factors that can harm manatees so that the space is available for the ones that are currently part of the UME. So leaving seagrass alone, letting it be where it is. And then if you're out on a boat, using polarized sunglasses so that you can see under the surface of the water better, because of course manatees, when they breathe, they just stick their little snout out, so you don't see a whole lot of them above the water. And then having a spotter on your boat. It sounds really boring, but like put somebody at the bow of your boat so that they can watch out for what's in front of your boat as you're going. And really little things like that can make the difference. You know, I can't tell you the number of times I've been on a boat and a manatee or a dolphin or sea turtle comes up right in front of us and we have to turn. But you know, we're always on the lookout for that. And then I will also put this link in the chat. There's the University of Florida IFAS Extension has a really cool website with resources on how you can landscape in environmentally friendly ways. Let's see. Okay, there you go. So that's a really interesting and helpful link. I really like organizations like that kind of, they do the hard work for you and just tell you kind of what to do to make your landscaping nature environmentally friendly. So I'm almost done with the kind of informational portion of this talk, and we'll move on to questions. But I really need to thank Andy Garrett. He's the Marine Mammal Stranding Coordinator for FWC. And I want to thank him and everybody at FWC. They're working super hard right now to save our manatees. And Andy also spent some time talking with me and kind of gave me some information that I didn't have about this so that I could relay it to you. So I really, really appreciate him for that. And then Terry Callison and the US Fish and Wildlife Service. They're kind of on they are on the front lines of this crisis. And Terry's the manatee recovery lead. So she's kind of in charge of this whole mess and she's doing an amazing job. And, you know, these people really, really care about our manatees and are working as hard as they possibly can and harder to fix this problem. And then, as I mentioned, the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership, those guys are so helpful. I'm proud to be part of that, working for Mote. It's a really exciting thing to be able to actually go help rescue a manatee, even recovering a dead manatee, you know, and knowing that we're going to learn from that is really exciting. And, you know, we try not to let these animals die in vain. So it's a really, it's an honor to be a part of that, you know, getting that information and making sure we do right by the animals. And then, of course, we can't do anything we do without donors and volunteers. Most of these organizations have more volunteers than actual paid staff. And of course, I want to thank all of you for coming to this talk today and thank you for your interest and for sticking with me through this talk. I really appreciate it. This is the only way we're going to solve a lot of these problems is by people being interested and caring enough to learn more and pass on that information. So thank you so much. And thank you to DCP for having me and allowing me to do this talk. And just before I finish, I'm just going to put these two more links in the chat. So there's a link about that you can read more about this UME in particular from FWC. And then there's also a link for the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership that has some more information on what they do. So I will put that in real quick and then turn things back over to Kel. Okay. Oh, actually, I lied. One more slide. So these, if anybody is interested and wants to take a screenshot, or you know, I know you'll have this recorded, but these are some of the papers that have a lot of. If you're interested in the more technical scientific information about this, these are really interesting papers that kind of explain how we got to where we are today. So highly recommend if you're into some scientific reading later on.
All of that.
Okay, I'll stop sharing. There we go.
Awesome. And before we get to questions, I will just remind folks where you can find the rest of our recorded webinars. So just head to our website, dolphincommunicationproject.org, look under that education tab, and you'll find the webinars there. We have deep dives, which this was, so kind of more advanced topics, a bit longer. And then we also have dolphin lessons, which are for the younger audience or the younger at heart. They're shorter, drawing lessons, things like that. And then if you blow through our webinars and you still want more, make sure you check out our podcast, The Dolphin Pod, also available directly on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. And then just like Amberly had to thank everybody, DCP obviously also needs to thank our supporters. And if you would like to support DCP, you can do so in a variety of ways. Sharing the information that's on our website, passing it along to friends. You can adopt a wild dolphin, become a member. We have swag available. And then you can even join us in the field. So right now, depending on when you're watching this, but July 2022, we have a program happening in Bimini in the Bahamas, and I believe our June 2022 program to Roatan still has a couple spaces available. And if you can't join us in the field, you certainly can stay in touch. So please do so at our website, email, and social media. And with that, we will sneak in a few questions if Amberly still has some time.
Yeah.
One of the questions we got was about the influx of manatee deaths in this unusual event. Are they across the board in terms of ages, or are you finding that it's the younger, less experienced manatees who are having a harder time finding food?
Wow, that is a really, really good question. And I will be honest, I don't have that answer. But my guess would be, based on the circumstances, my guess would be that it's across the board, because I think what they're seeing is that even the experienced manatees, where their food normally is, there's no food there anymore. And so I don't know for sure, but if I had to make an educated guess, I would think it was probably across the board, because it's we definitely do see in younger manatees, you'll see them, it's, with more cases of cold stress because they forget where to go for the winter after their first winter away from their mom. They're not always great at remembering the warm water sites. But in this case, even the ones who do know where to go don't have the resources there that they used to. So that would be my best guess. That's a really good question, though.
Another question is diving deep into that graph, that NOAA graph that you showed, and you may not know the answer. We understand that you are not with NOAA, but someone was wondering the undetermined / pending category. Do you know kind of how long will an investigation stay open? How long will it stay pending before the scientists just kind of say, we're not going to know the answer to why this stranding happened? Does that take like a few weeks, a few years?
That is also a great question that I think is going to be different for each one. So I haven't been part of one yet, fortunately, where they don't know, where they don't have the explanation, but I would imagine, because when it's declared a UME, there is that additional funding and resource availability. So some of that is to cover testing, lab tests, things like that. So I would imagine, I'm trying to think if there are situations in which that testing would take, an inordinate amount of time. And I can't think of one off my head. I'm sure there are some. But for example, red tide, with the 2018 red tide UME, I mean, you could smell the air and tell it was red tide. So that was and then we confirm it with laboratory testing, but that usually takes a few weeks. And so that was a pretty quick and easy one to tell all the sea turtles and dolphins that were stranding had red tide. So I don't know if there really is an answer to that. There may be a cutoff point where they just say, we don't know, we're not going to know. But I would imagine it's a very case by case kind of situation, depending probably primarily on laboratory testing, because that's where we find out most of the information from necropsy is, what's going on with the tissues and stuff.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'll see how I do on this. This question has kind of two parts, I think. The rehab facilities outside of Florida, I was surprised. I didn't know that existed, that a manatee would be sent out of state. So someone is wondering if they go out of state, are they still eligible for release? So will they then have like a return trip to Florida?
Yes. So an interesting thing about manatees is that technically all of them are conditionally releasable, meaning that in a worst case scenario, if there's no manatees left in the wild and we need to repopulate, theoretically, the ones in human care, such as Hugh and Buffett, could be released. It's highly unlikely because, of course, they haven't learned how to live in the wild because they were both born under human care. But it is the kind of the verbiage is there just in case. But most of the ones that are being rehabbed outside of Florida are candidates for release, and they're just being taken care of. A lot of times it's, if the little ones need to make a certain weight before they can be released, but they're otherwise healthy, they can go to these facilities, or ones that are, made weight or are adults and are mostly healthy, but just need a little extra TLC before they go. Those are some of the ones that are included in the out-of-state ones. And then there are some that are sent out of state because they're not releasable. And so they are now ambassador species or ambassador animals that can serve to educate people who don't live in Florida and don't see them all the time. So it's a little mix of both, but being sent out of state doesn't necessarily mean that they're not releasable. And so they'll get a return trip eventually.
Oh, lovely. And that's really interesting about DHL stepping up
Oh my
and
gosh, I thought it was so
being a
cute.
part of that.
Yeah, I think it's.
We had a manatee in Bimini years ago that for a variety of reasons, the decision was made to send him back to Florida, and he got a ride on a U.S. Coast Guard cutter.
Oh,
so
wow.
He got a special escort across the Gulf Stream. It was fun to be a part of that.
That's great. And they do, it's worth mentioning, they do get themselves into local areas that aren't necessarily appropriate, but are close enough to Florida that they get there on their own. So every year, a bunch of them go up to South Carolina, and there's a power plant, or it's either a power plant or an old mill that has a warm water outflow that then they need to be kind of corralled back, and they take them back in like U-Haul trucks. And there's actually an animal right now I think it's still there in SeaWorld San Antonio, that made its way to Texas and was not particularly healthy. And so because this was going on here, SeaWorld San Antonio really stepped up, and they were like, all right, we'll take the manatee and rehab it and take care of it for you. So they go all over.
They're explorers. Excellent. Well, I feel like I have some homework to do to learn more about the fertilizer issues and the issues in the Indian River Lagoon, but I won't put you on the spot with all of those technical questions. I'm gonna tell myself I'm gonna do some homework and some research on my own to learn more about the human impacts and what's going on there with the runoff and things like that. Oh, I think Kathleen wants to, there you go.
Along those lines, and I know that you were, since I live on, just south of the Indian River Lagoon, we have seen in the news over the last couple of years, the environment impacted by the runoff from Lake O on both sides. And so when you were talking about the $53 million that's been earmarked to fix the septic sewer issue, will any, do you know, will any of those funds go towards trying to rectify the runoff situation that adds significantly, in my view, to the polluted waterways?
I think so. The $53 million was part of a bigger package. So that's the money that's specifically for the IRL.
Okay.
But I know there's other money like on top of that. That's all, but all of that is part of a Clean Water Act. So I don't know specifically, but I would imagine part of that, because Lake O has been such a big topic of conversation and such a big issue. We even had in 2018, when there was a really bad red tide on the Southwest coast, there was the blue-green algae in Lake O, and they started draining that into Southwest Florida.
Yeah.
And the blue-green algae dies once it hits seawater, so it doesn't affect the animals, but then dead blue-green algae feeds red tide. So it was just this like lose-lose situation. So I'm not 100% sure, but I would be shocked if some of the money wasn't for that, because I don't know if I should say shocked. I would be surprised and disappointed.
Disappointed? Yes.
Join the club. Yep.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. But yeah, it really is a lesson on how nature knows what it's doing, and how when we mess with that, we are then gonna ultimately have to pay the price. And unfortunately, the manatees and a lot of other nature pays the price, but I think it would have been easier to not build the canals in the first place than to now be spending all this money cleaning everything up.
Here, here.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if I could just, on a completely different topic, because it sounded a little surprising to me, although maybe my inner manatee goes along with it. When you were saying they get cold stressed, was it 70 degrees or 78 degrees?
78 degrees.
Okay, I do have an inner manatee, because I think 70 degrees is cold, but 78 is like, okay, yeah, that's wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so an interesting thing about that is, manatees look, if you look at them from the outside, like they have all kinds of insulation. They look like they are like big fat whale animals, and they actually have a very, very thin fat layer, and most of their bulk is intestines. And so when I first started doing this and learning about manatees, I had no idea that they were such just delicate animals who really, really thrive in warmth and need that warm water.
Well, I understand. I agree with them.
I have a question along those lines. The groundwater coming into the springs is much cooler than 78 degrees, yet they seek that out in the winter. Is that just temporarily they seek that out, 72-degree water?
No, I think that's a good question.
Didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, I'm now starting to wonder if I got the temperature wrong.
Okay.
I did get it wrong. It's 72 degrees.
Okay. All right.
Woohoo, that's okay. Makes me feel better.
No, it's definitely warmer than the surrounding water, but you get into that spring water and you spend an hour in it with a thin wetsuit, and you're flat cold still.
And you're amazing.
Oh yeah. Oh, I am in an instant in the water. Bimini, I think, is the only place I haven't gotten like the shivers being in the water for a long time.
Yep.
But yeah, that's my mistake, because the springs are like they're like low kind of threshold.
Lowest.
Yeah.
And in the winter, if you go to like Crystal River or Blue Springs or any of those, that's manatee haven up there. So
yeah, that's
so yes, Can we do like a
Is there any-
voiceover in the recording where I just
We're
say,
recording.
"72"?
That's okay. We're good.
We'll put a little something. We're good, and always good to get it correct in the end. And oh, look, everyone, we're human.
True.
When they're congregating, and we can make this. I'm looking at the time now. We're just having a chat now.
You got me all night. I could talk about manatees for days.
When they congregate, now I'm picturing them congregating around the warmer waters, relatively warmer waters in the winter. Is that strictly like a space thing because they all want to be in the borders of the warmer water, or are they actually getting body heat from each other? Are they getting a benefit from being in a group?
I don't know if we know that. There may be some studies on it. I know there have been like kind of thermal manatee studies, but I haven't heard one way or the other if that's what they're doing. I would imagine there is some element of body heat because they're mammals. So it would make sense. But I don't know for sure if that's been proven or not. But I would imagine. An interesting thing, there's a colleague of mine at Mote, Beth Brady, and she's studying manatee vocalizations. And so she's actually gotten some cool information and cool data on their communication because they're largely seen as solitary animals and not very social. But apparently there's quite often a lot of talking going on with those big congregations. So I thought that was kind of cool that maybe they chit chat a little bit while they're all together.
Maybe there's some sort of exchange of information, a social function in addition to the sharing the warm water resource function.
Yeah, I would imagine. Or it's that all of them just being like, you're too close, get away. I don't know.
Yeah, personal space, 6 feet.
So yeah, I think there's a lot left to learn about manatees, which is really exciting.
Yeah, thank you so much for leading this and letting us put you on the spot with lots of questions that pop into our listeners and our own heads.
They were really good questions.
And we hope everyone listening gained some new information and maybe are inspired to go find out some more information and see what you can do with your voice and your vote to fix some of these issues. So with that, we will sign off and hope to see you at another webinar.
Thank you all so much. Nice to see you all.